Well, this is the time of year for good ghost stories and maybe even some ghost appearances. Yes, it's almost Halloween. Joanne Christensen knows a lot about strange and unexplained occurrences in almost every corner of this province. Joanne is the author of some ghost story books. They're titled Ghost Stories of Saskatchewan, More Ghost Stories of Saskatchewan, and as if that's not enough, she produced a third book called Ghost Story Saskatchewan 3. And Joanne joins us from her home in Edmonton. Hi, Joanne.
Hi, Costa. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm sure your ghost stories are in great demand at this time of the year. What got you so interested in ghost stories from Saskatchewan?
You know what? I've just loved ghost stories in general my whole life. And then I met one of my best friends is from Saskatchewan, grew up in Regina, has lived in Saskatchewan most of her life. And when I met her, she started telling me some ghost stories some things she had experienced growing up, and some stories that she had heard from other people that she knew in Saskatchewan. And so that kind of got me hooked on Saskatchewan variety of ghost stories. And nobody had paid any attention to them. You know, there were some books out at that time about ghost stories in the Maritimes, and a book had just come out about Alberta ghost stories. And I thought there are great ghost stories in Saskatchewan, and someone needs to start collecting these. So I started doing it.
And you did it so well. I mean, 3 books, and it's a series of short but very well written stories that I encourage people to pick up any one of those books because they're available out there. But what makes, and perhaps I can ask your theory on this, what makes Saskatchewan such fertile ground for ghost stories and ghost sightings?
You know, I think the point, Costa, is that there's no reason that Saskatchewan shouldn't have as many ghosts as it has people. You know, wherever there are people, there are bound to be ghosts. It just is of society. It's part of any culture, and and Saskatchewan has a very interesting history too, and a pretty dramatic history. So, lots of opportunity for stories there.
For those who have never experienced anything like this, generally speaking, from the people you've spoken to, the research you've done, what's it like having a ghost sighting? What's that experience like?
Well, it depends on, of course, what type of experience that you have. But, by and large, ghosts aren't. They aren't trying to be frightening. They aren't trying to be aggressive or malevolent at all. Like Hollywood would lead us to believe. But most ghosts, when people are dealing with them, they're disconcerting because they don't expect. And if you want to think of it in terms of an analogy, if you're sitting at a bus stop and somebody walks past you, that's not a frightening experience. But if you are sitting on your living room sofa and someone walks past you and that person is not supposed to be in your house and you haven't seen them before, that's disconcerting. It's not that the action itself is threatening or that apparition is trying to frighten you, but you're frightened because you don't expect them to see there. You don't expect to see them there. And, if you see, appliances turn on and off by themselves, or you see a teapot, suddenly float up and move across the room. Again, you're not expecting that, and it's very unsettling. But most people that I've talked to haven't really, the majority of them who have had ghost experiences, they're not frightening experiences. There are exceptions, of course, but most of them are just fine.
Well, that's good to know, just in case I do encounter one. Ghost stories, though, your books were written a few years ago and they're still selling. What's the interest, the popularity of ghost stories these days?
When I was first writing these books, they were hugely popular. And then the interest seemed to die down a little bit. And now it feels like it's coming back. And I would attribute a lot of that to the growing popularity of podcasts and the interest in podcasts, because we're sort of, through technology, which is kind of cool, we're rediscovering how much we enjoy having stories told to us and how much we enjoy sharing stories with one another. And a lot of podcasts certainly have, are paying attention to this sort of subject matter. They're, you don't have to look too hard to find just dozens and dozens of podcasts that are devoted to ghost stories and paranormal phenomenon and, all things like that make for good stories.
Well, you have dozens and dozens of stories to tell from your books. Maybe we can zero in on a couple to give people a sense of the kind of ghost stories that you wrote about. There's one here that caught my eye, maybe because it's the COVID era we're in, but this is a setting, the setting of this ghost sighting is during the outbreak of the Spanish flu, and it has to do with the doctor's wife. Can you tell us a little bit about that? This happened in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, that was a story from Broadview, Saskatchewan. And it's, yeah, of course, people who didn't even know about the Spanish flu before this year certainly do now because it's kind of a reference point to us. But yeah, Spanish flu was devastating everywhere in the world. I think that, over 20 million people, I believe, died worldwide. And every part of the country and every corner of Saskatchewan was touched by it. And in Broadview, certainly they had so many deaths, they had to set up a second mortuary at one point. And the town doctor was just run off his feet. And his wife was one of the victims of the flu. So that was a very sad story. But he never remarried and he continued to practice in Broadview. And it was sometime after she passed away, he was called out in the middle of the night to see a patient. It was an emergency, and it was during a rainstorm. And so he's driving at night in the rain, very poor visibility, and came to a sharp turn in the road where right before a cut, where the railroad tracks would cut across the road. And so he's coming up to this corner and going, quickly because it's an emergency. He has to get to his patient. And all of a sudden, there's his wife on the hood of his Model T looking through the window at him. And so, of course, he's shocked and he slams on the brakes, comes to a stop, and the apparition of his wife is gone then. She just vanishes. But at that moment, a train goes barreling past.
Oh my.
And he couldn't hear the train approaching in the rain. He couldn't see it with the pouring rain and the darkness. And he most certainly would have been hit by that train had his wife not appeared to him and shocked him into stopping the car. So
there's also, of course, we'd be remiss in not connecting cemeteries to ghosts, and you do bring some stories on that in your books as well. Can you tell us one from that?
yeah, definitely. One of my favorites is the Tabor Cemetery, which is near Esterhazy, because it has so much history attached to it, and it's one of those ghost stories that when you're doing research, if you find something that, where you find a lot of archival newspaper articles and material, that's really a gold mine. And so the Tabor Cemetery is one of those stories. And it was founded in 1903 by a group of really openly anti-religious settlers. And so they wanted their cemetery to be far from any church, far from other cemeteries. They really wanted no religious affiliation. They wanted no sense of ceremony or anything around their burials. And so this cemetery is quite some distance from town. And it was not long after the cemetery was founded that there were stories about sightings of this spectral light that would float around the cemetery. And it was always described the same way. It was a very sort of like a dull red glowing orb. But what made it interesting was that it behaved differently depending on who you're referring to. It would dance around the trees that skirted the cemetery, but sometimes, often, in fact, it would be on the front road, and it would keep pace with somebody who was moving along past the cemetery, or it would chase people. So it became a very, very famous phenomenon. And by the 30s, I think it was also seen like during the Depression, it was cheap entertainment. So people would make a night of it, like they'd have dozens and dozens of people that would go out on a weekend, and it was like you pack a lunch and you bring something to drink and you go out and you hunt for the Tabor Light. So it became very popular. But by the late 30s, it was like 1938, there was a priest from Esterhazy who came forward with this sort of grand confession about the fact that decades earlier, he had actually gone to the cemetery and he had performed a sort of service for a child who had been buried there. And he did this against the wishes of the father and on behalf of the mother, who was very concerned about the soul of her daughter. I think this little girl was 5 years old or something. And it was right at that time. And he also, when he was praying for this child, he asked for a sign to prove that she had a soul and that there was a reason for him to be doing a service for her. And the Tabor Light showed up within days of him performing the service and never went away, really. So yeah, it was sort of, there's sort of this dramatic moment years later where he confessed to this, but people still hunt the light.
Yeah, there's so many to be told. I know there's one, and we can't cover them all, but if we can maybe do one more. And this one is known to a lot of people in southern Saskatchewan, especially those visitors to Moose Jaw. The Hopkins House, can you tell me something about that?
Oh, Hopkins House is probably one of the most famous haunted places in Canada because it was featured on a show called Creepy Canada that was, quite popular years ago. But it's a very, very haunted place. It's, this, and a cool place too because it's a public restaurant. So many people who don't know each other and have never met or compared notes or told each other stories have experienced the same things at Hopkins. So I think that makes it very credible. And there are just so many ghosts in that house, So it's like a haunted Victorian mansion that is now accessible to everybody because it's a restaurant. Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite stories from Hopkins is the ladies' washroom on the main floor is very, very haunted. And a woman who worked there as a hostess for years and years and years would avoid that washroom at all costs. And there was one time she went in there and she was washing her hands and she could feel a presence behind her. And there was no one in the washroom with her. And she looked up in the mirror and there was the ghost of a woman standing behind her, looking at her in the mirror. And I've got to think, like, everybody's kind of got their hot buttons for ghost stories, and mirrors is one of mine. Like, anything that shows up in a mirror is terrifying to me. So yeah, that's one of my favorite stories, but they have multiple ghosts there, so many sightings and so many witnesses.
Yeah, I've heard it. I've never experienced it myself. It's been a while since I've been at that restaurant, but there's so many fascinating stories to be told about ghosts. And Joanne, thank you so much for sharing some of those. And by the way, your books are still available out there. I checked on Amazon, on Indigo, they're out there. So I do encourage people to check it out and purchase them.